Thank you, Sandra, and thank you to our panelists. And also, just briefly before he walks out the door, I would like to get another round of applause for Kevin Doffing. Kevin, Kevin, I need you to come back if you can. I need you to come back. Not only just to recognize Kevin, because for the past 2 years, he's been carrying this program on his back quite literally. And I think as we saw during this last panel, it's his passion for the opportunity of transitioning veterans is why he's so committed to this space. And for that, salute to you, sir. So thank you. A round of applause for Kevin. We'll talk about that. All right, thank you. And so with that, we're going to quickly do a reset of the stage as we move into our 5th panel this afternoon, navigating the Arctic, energy security, and the geostrategic advantage. This was an issue which got brought up on numerous fronts as we talk about the Arctic, both as a spot of possible geopolitical conflict, but when we think through the supply chain ramifications of a warming Arctic and the new shipping lanes that will emerge from that process, a strategic challenge which we need to grapple with. And so now that our panel is set, it's my pleasure to introduce Commander Michael Hogan, who will moderate this session. Commander Hogan is the 2024-2025 Senior U.S. Navy Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. We're thrilled to have him here, so please join me in welcoming him and our distinguished panelists to the stage. Commander Hogan, over to you.
Thanks. Well, I'm glad to be here today, and I have the distinct honor and privilege of this panel of experts here to talk about the Arctic. So, goal of this panel, right, to examine the Arctic's crucial role in global energy security and the strategic defense posture required to protect access to its vast energy reserves. A brief introduction of our panelists. So virtually, I have Admiral James Fogo. He's a fellow submariner who spent 40 years on active duty, 11 of them as an admiral and commanded 9 times. His last command was the Trifecta Command as Commander Naval Forces Europe, Commander Naval Forces Africa, and Commander Allied Joint Force Command along NATO's southern flank in Naples, Italy. He retired in 2020 and assumed the position of Dean of the Center of Maritime Strategy at the Navy League. We've got Dr. Julia Nesheiwat. She's a U.S. Army combat veteran and served as the 10th Homeland Security Advisor to the President, where she led the development of the U.S. Arctic Security Strategy within the National Security Council. In 2020 to 2021, she was appointed as U.S. Commissioner on the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. She's currently Vice President for Policy and Insights at TC Energy and a board member at the Atlantic Council. Iris Ferguson currently serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Arctic and Global Resilience. In this role, she serves as the Principal Advisor to the Secretary of Defense and Senior Leadership for policy matters pertaining to the Arctic security and global resilience, including efforts on climate adaptation, mitigation, and energy resilience. And last but certainly not least, Ambassador Paula Dobransky is Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and a Senior Fellow at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She previously served as Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs from 2001 to 2009 and has visited both the Arctic Circle and Antarctica. Before we get started, a brief disclaimer for me that any opinions I express are my own and do not reflect the views or policy of the Defense Department, the Navy, or the U.S. government. So I'm going to start this with some general questions to go down the panel and then some specific topics for their areas of expertise. Following that panel, about 15 minutes left. Switch to some audience questions, so feel free to submit any questions on askac.org. But so this is the only panel in this whole seminar event that deals with a region. So to set the scene for everybody, why the Arctic? Why has there been so much recent attention from not just the United States, but allies, partners, adversaries? What opportunities and risks are present for energy security? And I'll start with you, Admiral Fogo.
Hey, thanks very much, Mike. And first of all, I'd just like to say, bravo to the Atlantic Council for bringing Mike Hogan in here, somebody I've known for a very long time. Not only is he a submariner like me, but also an Olmsted Scholar. And that's a very selective program that annually we send about 17 officers from all the services, including the Coast Guard, all over the world for a 2-year education and a master's degree, and they do all this in a foreign language. So Mike was in Turkey at a very difficult time, and we had to get him out of there and into Germany in a user-friendly environment where he could continue to use that Turkish language, but he prevailed and succeeded, and here he is as one of your fellows, so hats off. Hey, Mike, your question is a great one. I am probably, of all the incredible talent you have on the dais, they're the least qualified to talk about these issues, but I have been to the North Pole, so let me just say, the Arctic represents a significant portion of the Earth's surface, about 6%, but 30% of the world's natural gas and 13% of global oil reserves, as well as vast quantities of minerals and rare earths. You know, climate change has had an effect, and if you look at satellite imagery, we now see more blue than white north of the Arctic Circle, defined as 66.5 degrees north. In fact, Dr. Walter Burbrick and one of my old charges, well, my speechwriter, Rachel Gosnell, I think you all know Rachel, she's at the Marshall Center, you know, wrote a strategy paper for the Navy, and they called it the Blue Arctic because there's more blue than there is white these days. You know, I've seen the changes myself across 4 decades of service in my time in the Navy. On my shelf to the left, there's a picture of me in June of 1985, surfaced at the North Pole, and participated in interviews for Sherry Goodman's really great book, Threat Multiplier. And she interviewed me on the subject of that trip, and then a second trip up to the polar region 16 years later when I was in command of the USS Oklahoma City. The difference was there was a lot less ice. It was tough breaking through the first time, and we spent about 24 hours up on the ice. The second time, Oklahoma City did not go to the geographic North Pole. We were south of it because we didn't have a hardened sail. But I found lots of areas to come up and let the crew enjoy the Arctic environment, because some of these young kids had never been there before, by just floating up in a polynia, a wide open space. And there were lots more polynias than I remembered from 16 years prior. Also a reduction of pack ice and a reduction of the marginal ice sound. The next thing I noticed was the Russians were back. You know, we got a bit of a heyday there in the peace dividend after the Cold War, but they were back and operating. They're back operating up there significantly today. This gives, you know, more blue means more ocean. It gives everybody more access for commercial and military traffic in the high north. It's getting pretty crowded up there. And I won't reiterate the names of the 8 Arctic nations. I think people know who they are. It includes Russia, but we have observer nations and nations that define themselves as near Arctic nations, like the People's Republic of China. I think the closest point of land to the Arctic Circle from China is about 900 kilometers, and I subscribe to my friend Senator Angus King's moniker that if China's a near Arctic nation, that means the state of Maine is a near Caribbean nation. So it's probably, in my humble opinion, the next contested space in great power competition. You know, everybody worries about Asia and the pivot to the Pacific, but I think the polar region is heating up, no pun intended. You know, back to you, Mike.
All right, Dr. Nesheiwat, would you like to continue on that?
Sure. Thank you very much. It's, again, a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mike, for moderating, and a big thanks to Atlantic Council for hosting this entire summit with veterans and energy security. But the Arctic in itself, I mean, I'm glad you're asking the question of the why before we get into some of these other areas and details. It's astonishing to me to see that regardless of your background, department, agency, private sector, public sector, there just has not been enough focus and attention. And now more than ever, as the Admiral was alluding to, the ice is melting faster than any other region across the globe. It is opening up new shipping routes, for example. You've got the Northwest Passage, you've got the Northern Sea Route. As he said, increased traffic, not just within the United States and the Arctic nations, but also even with the near Arctic, as they call it, observers, if you will. That includes China. So in addition to that, when it comes to energy security, there are untapped resources in the region that not just includes oil and gas, but also minerals. So a lot of potential for that. And it'll require a lot of attention, a lot of focus. There are competing interests, as you can imagine, given the fact that there is increased traffic per se. There are environmental concerns, of course, that need to be balanced with that. And you're seeing a lot of increased military presence, especially from Russia. So it's an area where we will need a lot more focus, a lot more information sharing, a lot more data when it comes to the scientific research, but also the national security aspect of this, which ties very much into the energy security aspect. So I'll leave it to the rest of my panelists to elaborate further.
Dazzy Ferguson.
Great. Well, yeah, echoing everyone's appreciation for putting this fora on. I'm actually incredibly enthusiastic about this intersection of defense and energy. And it's long been an area where I feel like we need to devote more intellectual capital, not only in the Arctic space, but I think globally. My office was stood up just 2 years ago within the Department of Defense to try to elevate this issue within OSD policy, not only to look at the Arctic strategically, but to also look at energy transition issues and where we should be seizing strategic advantage for the Defense Department. So this kind of fora is actually right in our wheelhouse, and I'm really excited, again, that you guys are putting this on and applaud your efforts to do so. So Arctic, why? Why is it important for the Department of Defense? It's strategic. We've heard about some of the choke points that exist there, from the Bering Sea to the Barents Sea above Norway. It's also a really critical place for the department to project power from. Alaska is home to quite a lot of our aircraft that are actually belong to the Indo-Pacific. The forces are meant to flow to the Indo-Pacific in the event of a contingency because it's faster to fly from Alaska to Hawaii than California. It's faster to fly from Alaska to Europe in many cases. So it's very strategic if you look at the map from the polar projection. It's also our homeland. Alaska, in particular, is a critical piece of homeland that we need to protect and defend. It's where we are meant to detect our threats from. It's the closest avenue of attack for our adversaries, and so we need to be really mindful about our defense architecture that exists and ensuring that it's modernized effectively. Climate change and technological innovation are kind of eroding this buffer that I think we've long sort of relied upon as a department, and we are trying to get after some of these changes that are taking place. We've kind of talked a little bit about the strategic competitor activity, but that's certainly front of mind for us within DoD. We see Russia, despite the invasion of Ukraine, continuing to have a significant emphasis on investment in the Arctic region. They want to protect their assets there, but they're also interested in showing that they have the capability to hold our homeland at risk. We see interest by the PRC in the Arctic, and including in trying to insert themselves into governance to try to normalize their presence. And then what's new in the last several years is the increasing alignment between the PRC and Russia militarily. We've seen some of the investments that China has made in Russia, especially in the energy sector, but also they've been operating militarily off the coast of Alaska from naval exercises last year. And then just a week after we released our DoD Arctic strategy recently, there was a bomber exercise that the two of them deployed off the coast of Alaska. So we're seeing this increasing alignment with them, between them, and that's giving us, of course, a good deal of pause, but we're also, being very mindful that that's not necessarily an alliance, that it takes a lot to build an alliance, and just exercising with one another is not an alliance. So just wanted to be mindful of that as well. Just briefly on the DoD Arctic strategy, because it just came out, we would encourage you all to go and look at it. It's on the website, but we called for 3 E's. 1 is enhancing capabilities, 2 is engaging with partners, and 3 is exercising. And really, it's about ensuring that we have the right resources and investments to get after the changing operational environment, that we're leveraging this unique opportunity of our geopolitical alliance, including the enlargement of NATO to include Finland and Sweden, and that we're looking at capability development for the alliance as a whole and with these incredibly capable partners, and that we're exercising effectively and with intention, and that we're doing so that messages in a way that deters adversaries.
Thanks. Ambassador Bransky.
I was just thinking, what can I say that hasn't been said here in terms of these very detailed answers? So maybe let me look at it geostrategically and take what's already been said, really, and put it in, why does it matter? Well, it matters, first of all, I would say militarily, because we have seen, definitely in the case with Russia, Russia poses a threat. It did pose a threat to us in the Arctic, and it continues to do so by looking at the building of bases, by also activity that appears to be connected with cutting of underwater cables, as well as other kind of nuclear submarine activity. So number one is a military component here and a geostrategic component. It matters in terms of America's own national security interests, that of our allies and our partners. China also, I put in this mix, China is also a great challenge. It became an observer of the Arctic Council years ago. It is very active in striving to bolster its influence. And I think it's significant. I think one of you had said, actually, now I believe you did, Iris, that they've had these joint exercises. What's interesting about that, if you look at the behavior before of China and Russia, quite frankly, there was tension. Shoigu, when he was defense minister, actually he was even quoted as saying, countries that are not part of the Arctic should not be part of any governance structure. He was definitively pushing away any real involvement of China in that sphere, and that has really been a change. There's been a real shift there. So one is the military aspect, and geostrategically, it's of great importance, and we need to be concerned. The second is something that came out in the DoD strategy, and which the Atlantic Council cares about, and that is our collaboration with allies and partners. And here, a reaffirmation that we should be looking at more closely what we can be doing and how we can be doing it. And I say this, I remember Stoltenberg came to the Halifax Security Forum, and at it, he was talking about the Arctic. Norway has been in the lead, by the way. Norway actually, for the Arctic Council, gives over 40% of its funding over the other nations. But why is it important? It's also important in terms of NATO and our collaboration. And here, there was a shift, which is worth noting, and that's about the Atlantic Command, where the Atlantic is looked at in terms of our protection, and the Arctic is part of that. We didn't have that heretofore. So where are we now? It also matters in terms of the issue of, should we have an Arctic Command? That's been an issue that's been out there. I don't know how the other panelists feel about it. Personally, I think it's something that we should be looking at because of a kind of militarization in the region. So connecting the last dot to energy security is definitely with the melting of the ice, the issue of competition on transportation, competition for resources, competition for the rare minerals, no less oil and gas. The door is open. And you definitely have all of these players who are out there. Russia definitively, remember the planting of the flag back in, I believe it was 2008 when that happened. And then no less China's increasing interest. And then for the United States, we should be concerned with our allies and friends, and especially those members of the High North. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Ambassador. Yeah, so we talked a little bit about who's there. So 7 of the 8 Arctic nations are members of NATO. And then we talked about China, who has a huge interest, aligned with Russia, the 8th Arctic country. Recent ice pact between Finland and the US and Canada to make icebreakers. So some recent stuff, but to take your question looking forward, over the next decade, right, how is this going to continue to evolve that geostrategic problem? Who are going to be the new players? And what implications does that have for global energy security going forward? I'll start with Dr. Nesheiwat for this.
Yeah, something, Paula, Ambassador, that you noted is NATO. I think NATO could be doing a lot more when we think about international forums or groups that can come together. I think that they just had their summit this past summer here in Washington, D.C., so I think there was a topic about the Arctic in there a little bit at least. So hoping to see more involvement from that standpoint that would also help the geopolitical impacts of Arctic issues per se, and then also maybe more involvement with the EU. I think other countries also could be more involved that are, again, considered more observers, such as India. They've obviously got a lot of experience and interests in the region, Japan as well, South Korea, Singapore, which is a trade hub. So there's a lot of opportunities geopolitically to have other countries involved and building those alliances and those partnerships, which will be important. And then finally, I would just also add, it's important to also look at it not just government to government, but public-private partnerships too. A lot of opportunities to work with the private sector, not just from an information research standpoint, but also having more investments to help boost the economy within the region. I've spent some time up in Greenland, for example, and I know there's a lot of opportunity, and they welcome that opportunity. Working with indigenous communities is another example where I think if we had more U.S. interests up there, that could be helpful, both from a geopolitical standpoint, but just even from a national security standpoint.
Mike, may I just jump in if I
absolutely.
can on the NATO piece? I mentioned it, and I think it's an important piece that NATO has to decide. In terms of, as I mentioned, the command structure, Arctic actually wasn't part of the real discourse before in a focused and a meaningful way. And here, integrated and interoperability matters in terms of our efforts, data, communication, intelligence. And towards that end, NATO certainly provides that kind of umbrella and focus. Finland and Sweden, by coming in, especially, I want to highlight, add value, especially in this regard. But I mentioned, and I want to underscore it again, I remember with Stoltenberg, the core question was, well, what are you going to do with NATO and the Arctic? And so, as I said, Norfolk has Atlantic Command, and in which these pieces come into play. But the question is, and I'm curious what all of you think, should there be an Arctic Command? My own personal view, as I said, I think there's some value in having a real focus on it. Why? Because it is of geostrategic importance, and also because the trend has been, without a doubt, very, very clearly, that there has been, if lack of a better term, a kind of militarization, actually, of that region. So there has to be a kind of defensive strategy. It's not going to go away. It's only been evolving and really becoming more of a focal point. And something Iris has been involved in when we first met, because the Air Force issued a space strategy, and that's about hypersonics. The Russians have already been using, the issue of hypersonic missiles, and the question of space and the Arctic is also part of that future discussion. Well, it's here and going beyond.
Yeah, no, these are all really excellent points. Where are the trend lines? From a geopolitical perspective, I think we're going to see increasing alignment with the Arctic, like-minded partners and allies. I think that we are just kind of at the tip of the iceberg and unpacking what is possible in terms of capability development. The Ice Pact is a great example of where we can start to lean on one another and learn from one another. And in many ways, our Arctic partners are more proficient in Arctic operations than we are. And we're seeing that actually now that our troops are frequently flying over to the Nordics to train in cold weather gear, and vice versa. The geographies are very different, though, too. It's worth noting that the European Arctic is much wetter, and our North American Arctic is much drier, and so the equipment isn't always the same. The infrastructure is not the same. The Arctic is not one specific location. It's a vast set of geographies that are very different than one another that you have to think about differently when you talk about capability development. I also think we're going to continue to see the alignment of PRC and Russia, because Russia is very dependent on some of the PRC capital. And I think that we're going to continue to see Russia try to ensure that its interests are defended effectively in the region. But just to go back to the role of NATO that I think is so critical here, one of the other parts of my office is in thinking about energy transition at large. And in advance of the NATO summit, we worked really closely with NATO to think about energy transition concepts in general. And our argument is that militaries that best take advantage of energy transition are going to be at a strategic advantage of those that do not. That also goes for countries, but militaries in particular. And so we've worked really closely with NATO on some of the interoperability challenges that could be on the horizon, including battery standardization, microgrid standardization, standardization, aviation fuel standardization. All of these things are things that we need to be thinking about now as we make investments, as we lean into understand where the commercial sector is going so that the military is not left behind, but really with a keen eye on interoperability first and foremost so that we're not evolving in our own unique silos. So just wanted to make sure that folks are also thinking about this broader implications of the role that NATO can play in building out capacity for the energy transition beyond just the Arctic space.
So before I go to you, Admiral Fogo, Ambassador Bransky talked about potential of an Arctic command. And I know some people have been calling that you can't militarize the Arctic, but in your opinion, has the Arctic already been militarized, and should we continue? Should we stop? Where should we go from here?
Yeah, I'm of the opinion, and when I talk to people affiliated with the Arctic Council, oftentimes they'll tell me, particularly the ambassadors that are part of the Arctic Council, they'll say the Arctic Council would like to prevent the militarization of the Arctic. And my response is, well, personally, I believe that the Arctic has been militarized since the time of Commodore Perry's trip to the North Pole in 1909. I was up there on my first submarine, Mike, in 1985. Many American submariners went before me. USS Nautilus sailed under the polar ice cap, first ever in 1958, and that was smack dab in the middle of the Cold War. So, with less ice and more blue ocean, we're seeing the presence of a lot of commercial and military traffic up there. And Ambassador Dobransky mentioned Russian submarines, near and dear to my heart and to yours, Mike. The Severodvinsk is a very capable platform that is categorized as an SSGN. It's very quiet. And the Russians have always put rubles into their design bureau, the Rubin Design Bureau, to produce additional platforms like that, despite the fact that they're engaged in the war in Ukraine. I'm sure the sanctions have slowed them down a little bit. They've got another boat out there that is very interesting called the Belgorod, and it was in sea trials in the last couple of years. Dual mission, deep diving mini sub, as well as the Poseidon supercavitating torpedo, which is out in the open literature. You can check out Covert Shores on this one. It's a great blog site or website. Potentially a nuclear propulsion plant in that torpedo, and potentially a dual capable warhead. For what purpose? Well, to transit the Atlantic and threaten the United States. Russia's got 56 icebreakers, many of them nuclear powered. Some of them are armed with Caliber class cruise missiles, the cruise missiles that have been used on apartment buildings in Ukraine. And I scratched my head about that. And it's like, who arms an icebreaker? Well, the Russians and probably the Chinese. Unfortunately, we have one icebreaker. I laud the ice pact with Canada and Finland. Should have done it sooner. And, we ought to be leasing icebreakers right now to increase the supply that we have. Polar Star is, I think she was commissioned in 1973, so 51 years old. China's got icebreakers too. And my fear is that in the militarization of the Arctic region north of 66.5 could become the Aberdeen proving ground for new weapon systems like the hypersonics that the ambassador mentioned. Both China and Russia have hypersonics, Zircon for Russia and DF-17 for China. We're still experimenting with our hypersonics. They're going to need a place to test them. The other thing that's interesting about the region and is ripe for competition and military competition is that the communications architecture up there in the high north is weak by Western standards. So what we have now is Elon Musk's Starlink. He's got 5,000 Starlink satellites in low Earth orbit, and only about 200 in the polar region. That's an area where I see the Chinese trying to grab space and establish their own networks and satellite constellations up there. And we ought to be thinking about that and investing in that. When I was up there on the Oklahoma City, the best friend I had was an Iridium radio, which worked everywhere. And for the rest of my time in the military, I always made sure when I went on a deployment someplace, I had an Iridium with me. And the last thing I'll say is on the militarization of the Arctic and the discussion of Russian submarines, I have wondered for the last year or so what the West will do when, and frankly, what Russia will do when the Chinese surface their first nuclear submarine at the North Pole. Ambassador Dobransky mentioned it back in 2007 when the Russians planted their flag at the geographic North Pole in the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, without anybody's permission, just a kind of a bold thing and a warning to everybody else, this is our lake, not yours. Well, what are we going to do when the Chinese show up, surfaced with an ice camp and a submarine at the North Pole? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe we just throw our hands up and say, well, so what? Maybe it matters to the Russians, but I think that's something that is indicative of their desire to project power and to become a world-class Navy. And it's something we're going to have to deal with. And that's going to make it even more crowded up there, particularly in the undersea space where we operate. Thanks. Back to you.
Thanks, Admiral. Pivot now to an audience question that I think is relevant. So we talked about NATO and allies and partnerships, but Russia has the largest coastline along the Arctic. So can we have effective Arctic governance without Russia? I pose this to whoever wants to give the first answer on this.
Well, Russia has been included, as the Admiral mentioned, the Arctic Council. Russia has been part of the Arctic Council, but as all of you may know, these last years, up to 2023, Russia was to be the chair. And all the other countries in protest, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, said, we're not going to be showing up for the Arctic Council under your presidency. So on one hand, from a practical standpoint, yes, and also because there's dumping. There's been a dumping that's been taking place, nuclear dumping along their coastline. So in a way, you have to include them. But right now, I think the step that the Arctic Council took to basically protest and demonstrate its protest against them was the right course of action in this case.
Thanks, Ambassador. Desi Ferguson, talk about your wheelhouse a little bit. So with the new Arctic strategy from the Department of Defense, how can the Department of Defense continue to enhance its strategies for Arctic resilience in the context of climate change and energy security? And practically, what does that look like?
Yeah, well, I think one, Admiral Foggo, thanks for your comments on space architectures that are so needed in the region. I think you have to be really intentional about putting up architecture in the Arctic because traditionally our satellites are geosynchronous and it kind of cuts off at around 70 degrees latitude. So that's a huge area of emphasis actually for our strategy and our enhancing our capabilities is looking at what we can leverage from space. Those Starlink satellites that you mentioned that are in the Arctic, actually the Air Force funded that initial tranche of satellites to the Arctic because there really wasn't a commercial case for them. We've been testing them for the last several years, and actually I had the privilege of going up to ISAX, the naval exercise that I think that you were mentioning earlier, sir. You head up to north of Alaska, fly into Dead Horse, and then you take another plane 200 miles north. You land on the ice sheet. You're at a camp in the middle of nowhere, and then you take a helicopter to the submarine and spend the night underneath the ice. Just truly remarkable capability and capacity, and just showing our ability to have deterrence anywhere in the world. I mean, like a life-changing, quite frankly, exercise to be a part of. But one of the things that I took away was actually the communications architecture. At Ice Camp, it was a Starlink satellite that allowed us to FaceTime from the ice sheet from 200 miles north of Alaska. That's remarkable. But that's a commercial capability, right? I think it's important that we have redundancy with commercial capability, but we also need military satellite communications in order to provide some of the more exquisite communications needs that we have. Just to get back to your initial questions on climate change and energy issues, one, I think we need to be eyes wide open about the role that climate change is happening in the Arctic region. I don't think that there's any denial of that. It's warming at 3 to 4 times the rate of the rest of the world. From a military perspective, that means our infrastructure is challenged, especially along the north slope of Alaska, which is experiencing coastal erosion at faster rates than we predicted. So we need to think about the architecture that we have for our radar sites, and if we need to move those or maybe move some of that architecture to space so that it's not vulnerable to incoming erosion. We also have permafrost to think about. We've long been thinking about permafrost in the DoD. This is not something that's new to us. We have the Cold Regions Research Lab that was really set up during the Cold War to try to make sure that we could build on permafrost, and has been doing a lot of engineering to make sure that that we're able to detect and track. What we're trying to do now is look at satellite forecasting of where permafrost might exist for future infrastructure issues or vulnerabilities. So that's where we're leaning into now. In terms of energy work that we're doing in the DoD, I think this intersection of Arctic and energy is also very interesting. You can talk about the strategic, the operational, and the tactical level. At the strategic level, we've talked about the amount of resources that exist within the Arctic region that are pretty significant. They're also pretty costly to extract right now. It's pretty cumbersome as well, especially if you're talking about oil and natural gas, and that's why Russia is so dependent on China for some of the financing. And this is a strategic implication for the United States, because some of that funding from China is going to bankroll the invasion of Ukraine. And so we're mindful of some of the cash and finance flows that are also creating strategic challenges for us as a department. At the operational level, it's very hard to operate in the Arctic. A lot of our installations, some of them that are most remote, are reliant on diesel generators. That's really expensive. It's costly. It's challenging. So we're looking at new innovation and types of resilient energy. We heard earlier today about the small modular reactor that we're piloting up at Eielson, outside of Fairbanks, which is where our F-35s are located, just down the street at Fort Wainwright, where we have our Arctic Angels. They're looking at geothermal energy, doing some real innovation in terms of how we're actually deploying energy. And then at the tactical level, things that you think work in the lower 48 just don't work in the Arctic, and that especially is true for batteries. So we're working really closely with our R&D partners to look at long duration energy storage that is cold weather survivable in some of our upcoming Arctic exercises, so that we can make sure that those that are exercising and practicing in the region have what they need.
Thank you.
Can I just add on, we mentioned the shipping, the icebreakers, which was terrific, as well as satellite systems. Also, just thinking about support for our U.S. Coast Guard, who manages it up there. The basic just surveillance and reconnaissance, for example, of having UAVs up there, other innovations and technologies that would allow them to do further search and rescue missions, things like that. So I think it's, the resources behind it will be quite critical, and I know you're working hard to push for that as well. Oh, and overfishing was another one, by the way, that we're trying to track and monitor.
Mm-hmm. One of the big issues, of course, has been the icebreaker. The Admiral mentioned one. Admiral, for some reason, I thought we had two.
The Healy.
But, okay,
Healy,
so.
But it had, suffered a fire.
Yeah, Haley had a fire, so she's out of commission.
Okay,
Yeah, right.
well, all right, so I thought, great, we moved to two, but no, we are outnumbered, and that also really impacts everything we do, whether it's in terms of rescue and search and survival. I mean, we're dependent on others, and including the question before asking us about Russia. I mean, there have been cases where we've had to depend on Russia in past years in terms of rescue. So that's something that I think is really incumbent upon our Department of Defense. It's always been an issue about what we invest in it in terms of our Coast Guard and the Coast Guard cutters, icebreakers, excuse me.
So going back to the audience questions here, talking about the opening of the Northwest Passage, which if you guys weren't aware, last week the first Panamax vessel traveled from St. Petersburg to Shanghai over the Arctic Circle. So cut that route down by about 2 weeks, 4,000 miles, right? Opening new routes, new cities can rise up and become shipping hubs because they're closer. Maybe that's the way. Mining, new possible mine exploration areas there. But are we set up, as the United States, set up to take advantage of these with our infrastructure in our northern cities? So we talked about some of the stuff up in the Arctic, but what about our near Arctic areas such as Maine, Washington State? Dr. Nesheiwat, I think you might be the best to answer this first.
It's certainly a work in progress. We're not there yet. We need to focus on our critical infrastructure, our ports, thinking about the trade and the commerce behind all the global impacts that it will have. Again, going back to the energy aspect of this with transition and making sure we do have off-grid solutions, microgrids, SMRs will definitely be a big piece of that. So again, it's going to take state, local, but federal level as well, work to do that in addition to those resources that I mentioned earlier. So I'd say we're not quite there yet. And again, as the ice is melting more and more, you're going to see that increased traffic, and we're going to need to be able to have that critical infrastructure in place. The transportation aspect of this, even just getting back and forth up there, aside from, I think right now, just to get to Greenland, you have to fly to Iceland. I mean, there's no way to directly go there. There's no flights or anything along those lines other than a military aircraft, of course. So the transportation piece of that will also need to be boosted and enhanced.
Ambassador Bransky, you mentioned great power competition, I think, in the beginning, in one of your answers. Can we win a great power competition without investing significantly in the Arctic? Can anybody win without investing in the Arctic?
The answer is we can't ignore the Arctic. And I think if there's something that ties all of us together on this panel, is that message. And I think we've articulated it in terms of the importance for energy security, the importance for homeland security and our national security interests, the importance also just for competition. I think the Admiral in his opening and then even later well documented and stated, I mean, what the Russian assets are, and I really focus on them first over the Chinese, interestingly enough, because they have made it a priority. In fact, they did release I think it was fairly recently, an Arctic strategy for 2035. So, Mike, the very question you're asking about what we're doing and are we projecting, they are already doing. They're already looking at their lines of communication, their ports, their bases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in this, we are behind. And I think I'm gratified that the Atlantic Council has brought us together with all of you, because this is a call to action. In this case, this is a ground of great power competition, 100%. And it's not just only on the ground and under the sea, but it's also in space. And I just point back to Iris, just because, as I said, we met because the Air Force released a strategy of looking at the Arctic, and especially also not just from land and sea, but space. We should be thinking about all of that. And it's going to be front and center. We are in an era of great power competition, and we're going to be for the long haul. And a word about China. China definitively is in a lead here in one sense. Their commercial, I think it is, and I wrote it down, COSCO, the China Ocean Shipping Company, COSCO. It almost sounds like Costco, but it has made already 8 transits. It's way ahead in terms of using the melting of the ice, of using these routes to transport, and it has economic implications, military economic.
We have the Polar Silk Road. Just take a look at
exactly, and they're even calling it that. Thank you, Julia. They're even calling it that.
Mm-hmm.
So we got about 5 minutes
Hey,
left.
Mike, one of the things that it's not broadly talked about, but I think it's really important, and that is, along the lines of what Ambassador Bransky was saying on great power competition. Since 2001, the Russians have challenged the status quo and the traditional boundaries in the continental shelf bordering on the Russian Federation. So they do that through the UN Commission on the Limits on the Continental Shelf. And we've largely ignored it. And they've hired really good lawyers. And they've been back and forth through the appeal process for a long time. And I think they have a good chance of favorable ruling here in the next couple of years, which will get them, and get this, they will control 460,000 square miles, or 70% of the Arctic continental shelf, inclusive of the oil, gas, and mineral harvesting rights there. One of their biggest trading partners is China. And I think you could make a case study for China today and Imperial Japan between 1937 and 1941. China's just a vacuum cleaner for oil and gas. And they're helping the Russians escape some of these sanctions that we've laid upon them because the Russians are providing them with that oil and gas. And you saw recently this past week where the Chinese provided some LNG generators skirting around the sanctions, even changing the name of one of their ships to get them to the Russians so they can operate them in the high north. So this really is a serious competition. And I was in the Navy for 40 years. I've been retired for four years now, and I have never seen the United States and her allies surrounded by so many threats.
Thanks, Admiral. So we've only got about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to go kind of lightning round to each person. But one actionable item that you would like to see the U.S. do going forward to up our Arctic policy. Start with you, Admiral Fogo.
Yeah, I think the people on the dais before you are, three of our best experts and public servants who are advocating for more awareness in the Arctic. I think the new DoD strategy with DASD Ferguson is a great one. And I think we need to continue to talk about this and increase public awareness, because I firmly believe that it could be the next battleground in great power competition. And we are certainly we are a legitimate Arctic nation, and we have a stake up there with our other allies and partners in the Arctic Council.
Dr. Nesheiwat?
I'd say I know there's been a lot of great work strategies that have been released. I think we just need to enhance more of that partnership and the frameworks. I mean, it's such a complex area when you think about the environment, the national security aspect of this, the energy security piece of it as well. How can we prioritize these issues? And I don't know if I mean, it's a work in progress, obviously, in some ways, but I alluded to earlier, we'll need the resources behind that, though, to come up with those priorities, number one, and then to back some sort of implementation of what we can do to support our military, number one, and be able to monitor and track the development in the Arctic overall. But we've got to prioritize that. And again, having a panel like this and these discussions are very helpful. But again, we're behind the curve. Russia and China are circling us, and we've got to catch up.
DASD Ferguson?
Yeah, I guess if there's one wish I had is that we could not other the region so much. I think it's kind of still thought of as this frontier that's so far away, that's just still emerging on this. I appreciate that, but it's just not reality. I mean, there is activity happening right now today. And so I would encourage, if you all have the opportunity to go to Alaska, go to the Arctic, go see how vast the landscape is and how tricky the distances are, but really how strategic the terrain is, quite frankly. It's really, it's important for us all as Americans to recognize the strategic jewel that we have as an opportunity as an Arctic nation, and to be leaders in ensuring that we are keeping the region stable and peaceful, but also protecting our interests.
Mike, you can count on me for a 2-second answer. I'm for awareness, funding, and Arctic Command.
I want to thank my distinguished panel up here for their wise words, and just to give my disclaimer again, right? All opinions I express were my own and do not reflect the views or policy of the Defense Department, the Navy, or the U.S. government. Thank you, everyone, for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.